want to talk a little bit about security and privacy. This is something we're really passionate about, both as an organization and us the web team. Security, privacy, and is key to the web. That's, I think, has been a main reason why web has been successful. So we need to continue to protect that. What we hope to cover today and what you should take away from this talk is that I'm going to say a few words about what Samsung is doing in Samsung Internet on client side, on the user agent side for protection, data protection. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we do to protect you online if you are using a product. And then Casey from Disconnect going to talk a little bit more about what are the trends currently on data collection on the web, in the cloud, and then what are the upcoming regulations that's going to impact that, what you do and what we all do. So I think most importantly, you should be all aware if you're working on a web property that you should really move to HTTPS. HTTPS stands for Secure HTTP. It is really key to protect the privacy between the user agent and the server. Currently, 70% of the web traffic is already on HTTPS. It's getting close to 80%, especially in US. This is a great number. If you're not on HTTPS, you're going to miss out, and it's going to be painful. Another thing to note is that more and more web features require HTTPS. So if your site is not HTTPS, essentially some JavaScript APIs will not be available for you. Beyond that, that's the basics. So what we do in the browser to give you a little bit more protection and security. One of our key principles is called Samsung Pass. It's essentially the brand name around our hardware integration with biometric authentication. This can mean either fingerprint or the iris scanner. So a lot of the sensitive data is protected with Samsung Pass. This means that not only storing data, but to retrieving data, you essentially often have to authenticate with Samsung Pass first before you get to sensitive data. Sensitive data means not only username and passwords, but also credit cards, or for example, making payments. One of the new features with Samsung Pass is that now it's also integrated with Android native apps, starting from Android O. So essentially, your username and passwords are syncs between Samsung browser and native apps, and they all still behind this the biometric authentication that Samsung Pass gives you. So this gives you a higher level of security on Samsung devices. Samsung Pass also works inside DeX. I have a little video that shows how that works. So you click on a good old web page that requires a login. If you follow the cursor, you see that clicked on sign in, and then the fingerprint authentication happened. And then let me just stop this for a moment. So once fingerprint is authentication succeeded, the email address and password is autofilled. But if you notice, the cursor is still at sign in. So you don't have to actually click on a sign in button. It will auto sign in for you if you're using Samsung Pass and biometric authentication. And boom, you signed in. So this is great. This is something I think most of us wish we would have on our laptops. And essentially now it comes with Android. Samsung Pass will manage your credentials. It will sync them between devices. You can edit what has been saved. But I think most importantly, it's also stored securely with Samsung Pass. So for storage, we use another Samsung technology called Knox. And the key idea here is that this is defense-grade security. We're working with the government to satisfy their requirements and get certified, and it's backed by hardware level security. So there's a secure element on the device that facilitates this secure storage. And Samsung Pass is relying on that. And this is all tightly integrated and just works out of the box. Another property of Knox is that it gives you a sandbox within Android where you can have your enterprise apps that enterprise can manage it for you if you have such an enterprise requirements. This is again another way where Samsung really takes security and privacy seriously, and this is what it translates to in the product. We have something that we call secret mode inside our browser. Notice that I didn't call it a tab. It's not an incognito tab. It's an actual mode of the browser. So you can switch between these normal modes and secret mode. And if you are in secret mode, it's again behind this biometric authentication. So to enter this secret mode, you have to authenticate yourself. And lastly, I would like to introduce your tracking blocker solution that's in partnership with Disconnect. So Samsung Internet has this extension mechanism that allows third parties to filter the traffic, essentially. And starting from version 6.0, which I think about a year ago, the Disconnect tracking blocker is pre-integrated with Samsung Internet. So it's already pre-installed. And what that gives you is it gives you tracking protection online. So your fingerprint is not all over the web, your data is not necessarily all over the web, but it's also not blocking all the ads. So you still see the ads, which is great because you're not necessarily interrupting all the monetization that's happening around what you do, but the ads are no longer personalized because of the tracking blockers. So we're really thankful Disconnect for this collaboration, and pleasure to have Casey, CEO of Disconnect, to talk a little bit more about their products and how they see the data privacy evolving going forward. Let me just bring up his slides. Thank you again. Thank you, Casey.
All right, I think this is on. My name is Casey Oppenheim. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Disconnect. Disconnect is an internet privacy company, and that's something that if I said that 10 years ago, people would look at me and say, what is that? What is internet privacy? In fact, when we were first trying to raise money for Disconnect and get it off the ground, that was a question that we got all the time. It was either, what is internet privacy, or nobody cares about internet privacy. And I think things have really changed. And I think, I guess what I'm here to talk about today is kind of where we were, where we are now, and where we're going, and what is the impact of the privacy security on the internet and on developers. So I guess my first proposition is that data protection is top of mind for consumers and regulators. And I'm just curious, because I live in this bubble of Silicon Valley, maybe you all do as well, but then I live in an even smaller bubble of a privacy bubble. So I'm following every story that's come out about privacy for the last, many years. And I'm curious, by a show of hand, if people agree with me that privacy is coming more to the fore, that people are more interested in privacy now. Yeah, anybody who doesn't feel that way? Okay, yeah, so everybody feels that data protection is top of mind, I think, for consumers and also for regulators. So I think one issue that we really had as a privacy company 7 years ago when we started was awareness, was what are you even talking about? What's the problem? What's going on? How is my information being collected? Why is data collection at that time, for advertising, why is that so harmful? And I feel like now we're at this point where things have really switched to the point where people are really questioning, is everything we do online vulnerable? I think the Edward Snowden revelations and then just kind of a constant drum roll of data breaches, hackings, and privacy violations have kind of put people in a state of not really being sure about, is anything safe? And the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of data collection that is happening behind our backs in ways that we wouldn't, we don't know about, and if we do know about it, we wouldn't want. And I think that, to me, the future of the internet doesn't look like less tracking, because I think that there's so many some of the biggest businesses in the world are dependent on user data. That's the oil that makes the machine run. But I do think that we're living in a time where people want to know more about this issue, and people are going to demand to know more. So this is actually a mess, but it's actually generous, because the reality of what's happening to our data every time we visit a website or every time we open an app, or a lot of the times when we're using IoT devices, there are a lot of companies getting your data. And there's actually potentially thousands more companies than this, because there's a whole daisy chain that happens to your data, right? So these companies are collecting it, but as we see from the recent Facebook Cambridge Analytica story that's come out, Facebook or any of these companies are actually sharing it with multiple parties. And so it goes from one person's collecting it to another, to another, to another. I think that change is coming. I think we're undergoing a major shift, as I've talked a little bit about here. I think the changes are going to come in two forms. One is that consumers whose privacy has been violated are going to take action. That action could be, you know what, I'm going to delete my Facebook account. Or that action could be, you know what, I'm going to turn on secret mode in the Samsung Internet browser. Or that action could be, I'm going to subscribe to Disconnect, or a service like Disconnect. The other place it's coming, and in Europe it's coming very fast, is through regulation. And so the General Data Protection Regulation is set to take effect next month. This is a pretty serious regulation that kind of resets data collection on the internet to a certain extent. So I guess before I'm going to talk specifically about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, without putting you to sleep, hopefully. But first, we can talk a little bit about consumer demand. And I think I've talked a little bit about the data breaches and the violations, but I think the fact of the matter is that consumers overwhelmingly want more control over their data. And the recent studies are bearing this out. So pretty much, I'd say not even 10 years ago, but I think back in 2010, Mark Zuckerberg was famously or infamously quoted as saying that privacy is dead. At that time, there were several companies were saying that, nobody cares about this stuff. And I think now we're at a point where that's objectively not true. I think people are kind of coming to terms with the fact that everyone does actually care about their privacy. It's just a matter of how you frame the question, right? If you say, do you mind if you share anonymous data about yourself in order to have a free Facebook account, I think everyone's going to say, not really. But then if you ask them, do you mind if we collect all your data, share it with a bunch of people who don't know who you are in order to sway the election, people are a little bit more concerned about something like that, right? And so I think that that's really what's changed, is that before I think there was this sense of there's no harm in all this collection of data. There's nothing bad can come of it. And I think that at this point, after Equifax was breached, and we're talking your most sensitive information, right? I mean, this was, what, 143 million Americans. Yahoo was hacked. It was 1 billion accounts were hacked. It was literally all their email accounts are hacked. That has your contacts, that has your real name, that has tons of information, right? I mean, if somebody has access to my email, I mean, that's some personal stuff, right? I mean, I'm using that to communicate with friends, colleagues. So I think that we're past the point where people can credibly say there's no harm to this. And people are actually not just feeling like their data's out of control. I think the 91% feel that they strongly agree that they've lost control of how their personal information is collected. But I think the second statistic is actually really interesting, which is that 86% are taking steps to actually protect their privacy online. And this study is from 2016. So I'd be really interested to see what a more recent study is saying about this, because my sense is that, based on your reaction, based on my sense, is that the concerns are definitely increasing. So the regulation that's coming, like I said, I think it kind of resets the internet. I think that if we were to start the internet right now today, the way that we would address data protection would be very different than how it happened actually in the history of the internet. The internet was made for speed. It was made for getting things and communicating things as quickly as possible. It wasn't built for security or privacy. It just that people, the people who were founding the internet and putting it together, that's not what was on their mind. They weren't seeing this vision of where we are today. So the GDPR is basically coming back to the idea that in order for people to collect your data, you should give them permission to do that. You should tell them, hey, we're going to collect your data, and this is how we're going to collect it. This is what we're going to do with it. So this regulation is going to ask for very transparent opt-in. This is not like, hey, click a box and you agree to the privacy policy, which you're never going to read, and which even if you did read, you probably wouldn't understand. Very possibly the lawyers who wrote that privacy policy didn't read it or understand what they were saying, but I think that it's very difficult to put that burden on consumers and expect that they come away with anything meaningful. So the regulation basically requires websites and apps, and for developers, I think this is obviously important stuff, especially if you're doing business in the EU, and it's almost inconceivable that you're not if you have a website that's accessible anywhere, or an app that is. You got to let people know what parties are going to receive the data, the purpose of data collection, how long the data is stored, consequence of not providing the data. Is data being transferred internationally? And if so, what safeguards are in place? And in case of auto decisions being made based on the collection of data, for example, pricing, profiling, what logic's applied. I mean, this is, if you look at this list, I mean, it's like, this is a significant change in the way that business is going to be done online. And so a lot of companies are scrambling to figure out, how does this impact our product offerings? How does this impact our user experience? What's the UI got to look like? And this is, like I said, I think this is going into effect in May, but then I think there's a grace period until August where you have to be in compliance. So the net effects is going to be, I believe, is that AdTech is going to become more reliant on the websites and apps for consent. So right now, you all probably know, when you visit a website, invisibly, there are many, many different network requests being made from companies that you don't have a direct relationship with. The same thing in the app environment. If you have a free app that you've installed, it's free because most likely there's things happening, there's data collection happening, and so that they can target advertising, or that they can sell that data to somebody who's going to target ads, or do it for political purposes, or many different reasons that we're learning about. So with the new regulation, and I believe that something similar will come to the US, not anytime soon, but the California Privacy Act is, I believe it's going to be on the ballot. People are going to be voting on that in California. There's other efforts underway to regulate the data collection. So I think what the net effect is that compliant third-party collection of the data is going to be difficult. So the third party would be Facebook collecting information about you on Facebook.com is not a problem. That's not going to be impacted significantly. But companies who are collecting data who you don't have a direct relationship with, they're embedded inside of apps, whether it's a pixel or whether it's a beacon or whether they're fingerprinting you, that's going to become, I think, much more difficult. And so there's a huge opportunity for developers to fill the demand for compliant user data. The impact on developers, I think, is there's going to be a lot of pitfalls, and there's also going to be huge opportunities because things are changing, and a lot of business models are going to be disrupted, and a lot of opportunities going to exist. So I'm going to try not to be too trite about this, but I think avoiding pitfalls, the key guiding principles are transparency. Be straight up with your users about what information you're collecting. That doesn't mean in a privacy policy. This is, this could be a couple sentences, but make sure that you have bullet points. This is the information that we're collecting, and this is what we're going to do with it. And then allow users choices around it. Give them control about what information they feel comfortable sharing and what information they don't. The last one is, and I think that this has really, really, really changed, and this is privacy and security. I remember being at data conferences where I would speak about privacy 5 years ago even, and I remember people from the stage, from a podium like this, saying, if you're collecting data is never a bad thing, basically, because you never know when it's going to be useful later on. And the idea was basically like, collect as much data as you can, and then you'll figure out what to do with it later. And I think that's completely switched now, where if you collect the minimum amount of data as possible, you don't want data unless there's a very, very good business reason for collecting it. The other thing is that, and what I mean by shut it down is, if you have APIs that are deprecated, that you no longer are using, you have internal pages or external pages that you don't need to have exposed, shut it down. Don't leave things open that are potential security vulnerabilities. And the last thing is obviously, and this is a tough one for startups, I think that you need to be much more aware of the laws around data protection and data privacy. So the opportunities are huge, like I mentioned. You give users what they want, you can win, and you can feel awesome. And I think that that's a really cool thing that's happening right now, is that we're going back to putting users in control of their data. And I think that developers who really embrace that opportunity, I think that there's big opportunities there. And there's a huge market, right? I mean, there's massive amounts of money to be made on online advertising, and right now it's basically going to a few companies. But I think that real disruption is possible in the next 5 to 10 years, where somebody can do things differently, more respectful, and they can chunk out a massive amount of this pie. So again, the trends are, there's a bigger demand for privacy and security. There's also a huge demand for user data, and the data protection regulation is going up. So I think those are 3 trends that hopefully developers will pay attention to at companies like, big and small. And that's all I have for now.